Most Corsair videos open the same way. Design competition. Inverted gull wing. The fastest fighter of its era. Then they tell you the Navy couldn't land it on carriers, and the British figured it out first. Clean story. Wrong story. And it's not even the worst thing the standard Corsair narrative gets wrong. But we'll get to that. First, the carrier myth. Because this is the credibility test, and you already know the answer, so let's not waste your time. Commander John Thomas Blackburn, Tommy to the men who flew with him, stood up VF-17 on January 1st, 1943, and his pilots completed carrier qualifications aboard the escort carrier USS Charger in the Chesapeake Bay by April. They found the big Vought perfectly manageable. VF-17 deployed to the Pacific aboard the brand new USS Bunker Hill, CV-17, and then got detached in September 1943 to shore bases in the Solomons. Real landing deficiencies existed. The cockpit sat 3 feet too far aft. Oil streaked across the windscreen, and the oleo struts bounced hard enough to vault over the arresting wires. All fixable. But the Navy had found the Hellcat by then, and the Hellcat was a logistics dream, shared its Pratt Whitney R-2800 with the TBF Avenger, already on every carrier hangar deck, came off Grumman's line with a consistency that maintenance crews worshipped, and didn't require reshaping the entire fleet logistics system around a more demanding airframe. Blackburn spelled it out in his memoir, The Jolly Rogers, co-authored with Eric Hammel. The Corsair didn't lose its carrier slot because it couldn't do the job. It lost because the system chose a fighter it could absorb more easily. And VF-17 didn't stop using carriers. November 11th, 1943. Second major strike against the Japanese fortress at Rabaul. Blackburn's pilots recovered aboard USS Essex and USS Bunker Hill to refuel and rearm, then launched again. Operational carrier landings. Combat zone. 5 full months before the Fleet Air Arm put a single Corsair aboard HMS Victorious for Operation Tungsten on April 3, 1944. Through January and February of 1944, VF-17 continued intermittent carrier ops during the Green Islands campaign. VOC-1, Composite Squadron 1, was simultaneously working up with Corsairs for its own carrier mission set. The British contribution was genuine. They developed the curving approach path, modified the oleo struts, clipped 8 inches off each wingtip for hangar clearance. Real innovations that made high-tempo ops safer on smaller Royal Navy decks. That deserves credit. But first to develop better procedures and first to operate Corsairs from carriers are 2 entirely different claims. The second one belongs to Blackburn's Jolly Rogers. Full stop. Now, VF-17 scored 154 aerial victories between October 27, 1943 and March 8, 1944. Blackburn finished with 11 confirmed kills. His XO, Lieutenant Commander Roger Hedrick, claimed 12. Lieutenant Ira Cassius Ike Kepford claimed 16 in a Corsair he'd personally decorated with kill flags marching across the cowling, a non-regulation paint scheme the brass tolerated because Kepford kept killing Japanese aircraft. These men weren't flying a rejected aeroplane. They were flying the best piston engine fighter in the Pacific, and they knew it. But here's the thing. The most dangerous threat to a Corsair pilot in the Second World War wasn't always the Zero climbing up to meet him over Rabaul. Sometimes the threat was baked into the aeroplane before it ever left the factory floor. Sometimes the threat had a return address in Long Island City, Queens. And that's the chapter of the Corsair story that nobody tells properly. 3 companies built the Corsair during the war. Chance Vought, the original designer, produced approximately 7,829 airframes from Stratford, Connecticut. The definitive product from the people who conceived the thing. Goodyear Aircraft Corporation in Akron, Ohio, a tire company that retooled itself into a first-rate aircraft manufacturer through sheer industrial competence, delivered roughly 4,017 FG series Corsairs, and their quality was excellent, their production reliable, their contribution to the war effort beyond reproach. And then there was Brewster Aeronautical Corporation. If the Corsair's story is a redemption arc, then Brewster is the villain, or the tragedy, depending on how generous you're feeling. It's the chapter that aviation enthusiasts bring up at air shows and argue about over beers, and 80 years later, nobody can fully agree on what happened inside that factory. Sabotage, incompetence, criminal negligence. Pick your poison. The evidence supports all three, and that's what makes this story impossible to put down. To understand how spectacularly Brewster failed with the Corsair, you have to understand that Brewster was already failing before the Corsair contract ever arrived. The company had built the F-2A Buffalo, the Navy's first monoplane carrier fighter, an airplane that once carried genuine promise. There was a moment, brief and now almost impossible to believe, when Brewster Aeronautical was a company with a viable product and a future. That moment ended at Midway. June 1942, VM F221, flying F-2A Buffaloes from the island's airstrip, launched to intercept the incoming Japanese strike. 13 of 20 Buffaloes were shot down. An aerial massacre. There's no softer word for it. Major Vern McCall, one of the surviving pilots, reportedly wrote in his after-action report that any pilot assigned to fly the Buffalo against a Zero should be considered as having been given a death sentence. The aeroplane's reputation was destroyed in a single morning. Whatever the Buffalo might have been in 1938, by 1942 it was a coffin with wings, and every pilot in the Pacific knew it. That was Brewster's first product. Their second was the SB-2A Buccaneer, a dive bomber and scout bomber that was so poorly built and so endlessly behind schedule that it never saw combat with any American service. Not once. Hundreds of airframes, consuming aluminium, consuming rubber, consuming factory hours and skilled labor that the nation desperately needed elsewhere. And none of them ever dropped a bomb on an enemy target. Monuments to wasted potential and wasted resources in the middle of a global war where every rivet was supposed to count. Into this environment, a company that had produced a fighter pilot's called a death sentence and a dive bomber that never fought, the United States Navy placed a license production contract for the F4U Corsair. Designated the F3A1 under Brewster's production code. The logic was straightforward. Wartime demand for the Corsair exceeded what Vought alone could produce. Goodyear got the same type of contract and built the FG1. The assumption was reasonable. License production worked. Companies tooled up, followed the blueprints, and delivered airframes. Goodyear proved it could be done brilliantly. Brewster proved something else entirely. What happened next became one of the more infamous episodes in American wartime manufacturing. Start with the numbers, because the numbers alone tell a damning story. Brewster delivered roughly 735 F3A1 Corsairs over the course of the contract. Out of approximately 12,571 total Corsairs produced during the war, that's fewer than 6% of the total. And the number 735 flatters Brewster's actual performance, because a staggering percentage of those airframes were rejected outright by Navy acceptance inspectors, or accepted only conditionally, downgraded to stateside training duties, never trusted near a combat zone. Most of Brewster's Corsairs never saw a combat zone. Some of them probably shouldn't have left the factory. Navy inspectors stationed at the Long Island City plant found themselves refusing aircraft at rates that would have shut down any competently managed operation within weeks. Rivets improperly set, not a few, not on one bad Tuesday, but as a recurring pattern across airframes. Structural components misaligned to tolerances so far out of specification that the aircraft were genuinely unsafe to fly in their as-delivered condition. These weren't cosmetic defects. These weren't the kind of minor punch list items that get caught in final inspection and fixed before delivery. These were fundamental structural failures on aircraft that men would strap into and fly at 300 miles an hour, trusting their lives to whoever had driven those rivets. And then it got worse. The rumours started circulating. And they weren't quiet rumours whispered in offices. They were vivid, specific, and they spread through the Navy's aviation maintenance community like wildfire. Tools found sealed inside completed wing panels. Think about that for a second. A wing panel gets riveted shut. Inside that panel, where no maintenance crew will ever reach without tearing the wing apart, there's a wrench, or a screwdriver, or a pair of pliers. Sitting against the internal structure, waiting to shift in flight, waiting to jam a control cable or puncture a fuel line at 20,000 feet over the Pacific. A mechanic doesn't accidentally leave a tool inside a sealed panel. Someone puts the tool down. Someone else rivets the panel shut. Either nobody noticed, which means supervision was non-existent, or someone placed it there deliberately. Either explanation is horrifying. Bolts left deliberately loose on critical structural fittings. Wiring harnesses cut or crossed in ways that would create electrical failures in flight. Not immediately, not on the ground where you'd catch it during pre-flight, but later, in the air, when the vibration and heat and stress of combat flight worked the damaged wiring to the point of failure. The kind of defects that kill pilots in ways that look like combat damage or mechanical failure, not sabotage. The kind of defects that might never be traced back to a factory floor in Queens. The labour situation at Brewster was, by any reasonable assessment, a rolling catastrophe. Absenteeism sometimes exceeded 20% on any given shift, meaning on the worst days, 1 in 5 workers simply didn't show up. Not sick, not on approved leave, just gone. Wildcat work stoppages disrupted production schedules that were already hopelessly behind the contracted delivery timeline. The relationship between Brewster's management and its workforce had deteriorated past dysfunction into something closer to mutual contempt, a dynamic that, in fairness, probably fed on itself. Demoralized workers produce bad work. Bad work draws scrutiny and punishment. Punishment demoralizes workers further, and the cycle accelerates until the whole thing collapses. Management couldn't control the factory floor. The factory floor had no trust in management. And somewhere in the middle of this poisonous stalemate, aircraft that American pilots would bet their lives on were being assembled by people who either couldn't or wouldn't do the job right. Federal investigators got involved. Period documents reference FBI involvement at the Brewster plant, though the precise scope of the investigation and its formal findings remain frustratingly incomplete in the available historical record. One of those wartime paper trails that either never got fully assembled or got filed away in boxes that historians haven't fully excavated. Joshua Freeman's academic research into Brewster's Long Island City operations, published through the City University of New York, paints the most detailed available portrait of what was happening inside those factory walls. And it's a picture of an organization that had failed at every level simultaneously: management, labor, quality control, morale, oversight, and basic institutional competence. So which was it? Sabotage or incompetence. Some historians argue the sabotage stories were overblown or outright fabricated. Wartime paranoia projected onto what was really just the predictable output of a demoralized, undertrained, poorly supervised workforce trying to build extraordinarily complex fighting machines in a factory run by people who should never have been given the contract in the first place. Under this interpretation, Brewster wasn't evil. It was just broken. Bad management created bad conditions that created bad airplanes, and the sabotage narrative was a convenient way for the Navy and the government to explain away systemic failures that would have embarrassed everyone involved. Others look at the specific incidents and find that explanation inadequate. A tool sealed inside a finished wing panel, a bolt loosened on a fitting that a worker would have had to deliberately access and turn. A wiring harness, cut, not frayed from poor handling, not damaged by a dropped rivet gun, but cleanly cut, in a location that suggests intention. One incident is an accident. Two is a pattern. A sustained series of such reports across multiple airframes, across multiple shifts, starts to look like something darker than mere carelessness. The truth, and this may be the most honest thing anyone can say about Brewster, almost certainly contains elements of both. A factory in chaos, run by incompetent management, staffed by workers ranging from genuinely patriotic but poorly trained civilians to, possibly, a small number of individuals who deliberately damaged aircraft bound for the fleet. The sabotage narrative is too dramatic to dismiss. The incompetence narrative is too well documented to ignore. And the distance of 80 years hasn't clarified the picture. It's just made the argument more comfortable to have. What isn't ambiguous is the ending. The Navy pulled Brewster's contracts. The company was shut down in 1944, its factory seized by the government, its workforce dispersed into the wartime labour market, its corporate name reduced to a cautionary tale that the American aviation industry would remember for decades. Brewster Aeronautical Corporation ceased to exist as a meaningful entity, and nobody mourned its passing except perhaps the workers who had tried, some of them at least, to do honest work in an impossible environment. Meanwhile, across the state, a different story was being written every single day. Goodyear Aircraft Corporation in Akron, Ohio, a rubber and tire company. No history of building fighter aircraft, no legacy in naval aviation, no engineering tradition stretching back to the biplanes of the 1920s. Just a manufacturing organization that understood production discipline, tooled up a factory to Vaught's blueprints, hired and trained a workforce, and started delivering FG-1 Corsairs that were indistinguishable in quality from the ones rolling off Vaught's own line in Stratford. Over 4,000 of them, on schedule, on spec, combat ready. Every single FG-1D that left Goodyear's Akron facility was a silent, devastating rebuke to what had happened in Long Island City. You didn't need to be an established aircraft company to build a world-class fighter. You needed competent management, a motivated workforce, and basic institutional integrity. Goodyear had all three. Brewster had none. And the men in the cockpits, they didn't get to choose which factory their airplane came from. January 17th, 1944. Rabaul. The neutralization campaign was at its peak, daily strikes hammering the Japanese fortress complex from airstrips carved out of jungle on Bougainville. VMTB 232, Marine Torpedo Bombing Squadron 232, was flying TBF and TBM Avengers into some of the most heavily defended airspace in the Pacific, with Corsairs riding escort above them. The flak over Rabaul was thick enough to walk on, the pilots said. Not every crew came back from those missions. The men in those Avengers and those Corsairs were trusting their lives to every rivet, every bolt, every wiring harness that some anonymous worker in some anonymous factory had assembled months before on the other side of the world. They had no way of knowing if their airplane came from Vought or Goodyear or, God forbid, Brewster. They just climbed in, started the engine, and flew toward the guns. Decades later, grandchildren of VMTB 232 crew members still carry the knowledge of what their grandfathers survived, or didn't survive, over Rabaul that January. And when they tell those stories, they cut deeper than any discussion of supercharger staging or inverted gull wing aerodynamics ever could. Because that's what this aeroplane means to the people who care about it most. Not kill ratios, not design specifications. Family. The men who strapped in, trusted whoever built the thing, and flew. A Corsair with a loose bolt will kill you just as dead whether someone loosened it on purpose or never tightened it at all. The men in those cockpits didn't have the luxury of caring about the distinction. They cared about coming home. The properly built ones lasted. After the Pacific, after Korea, where F4U-4s and AUs-1s flew close air support that Marines on the ground depended on with their lives. After the French Navy took Corsairs to Indochina and flew them over Dien Bien Phu in 1954. After Argentina operated them. After the United States, through the Military Assistance Program, scattered surplus Corsairs to Allied nations across Central America. The aeroplanes that Vought and Goodyear built, the ones with the rivets driven straight and the bolts torqued right, and no tools sealed inside the wings, those Corsairs kept flying, kept fighting, for decades. Which brings us to July 1969. El Salvador and Honduras went to war. The triggers were tangled. World Cup qualifying matches, escalating riots, broken diplomatic relations. But the underlying causes ran deeper. Land disputes, illegal immigration, economic resentment built up over years. The fighting lasted roughly 100 hours. They called it the Football War. Both air forces flew into combat in surplus and aging aircraft. P-51 Mustangs, converted T-28 Trojan trainers pressed into combat service, and F4U Corsairs. Corsairs versus Corsairs. 25 years after Blackburn's Jolly Rogers were tearing apart Japanese formations over Rabaul, the same type of airplane, designed in 1938, first flown in 1940, was fighting itself over Central American jungle. Between July 14th and July 18th, 1969, Honduran and Salvadoran pilots flew piston-engine fighters against each other in what would become the last piston-engine air-to-air combat in recorded history. Honduran captain Fernando Soto is credited with the final kills, reportedly 3 enemy aircraft downed during a single engagement on July 17th, making him almost certainly the last pilot in history to score air-to-air victories in a propeller-driven fighter. 3 days before Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, Fernando Soto was killing in a Corsair. Those weren't Brewster airframes. Couldn't have been. Brewster's F3A1s were gone by then, scrapped, forgotten, reduced to their component aluminium decades before. The Corsairs, still flying in 1969, still dogfighting over Honduras, were the ones built by people who did the job right. Vought birds, Goodyear birds. Airplanes assembled by workers who drove the rivets straight, torqued the bolts to spec, and didn't leave tools inside the wings. That's why those planes were still alive 30 years later. That's why the men who flew them came home. 12,571 Corsairs, an 11-to-1 kill ratio in the Pacific. Aces like Kepford and Blackburn and Hedrick, Squadrons like VF-17 and VMF-124 and VMTB-232. Brewster built fewer than 6% of them, and most of those never fought. Every other Corsair, the ones that mattered, the ones that killed, the ones that brought pilots home, the ones that were still dogfighting in 1969, came from factories where somebody gave a damn. That's the real Corsair story. And buried inside it, like a wrench sealed behind a riveted panel, is the Brewster story. The one about what happens when nobody does. When management fails, and labor breaks down, and quality control collapses, and the people building your airplane either can't or won't do it right. We still don't know for certain which it was, sabotage or incompetence. Probably both. What we do know is that the men who climbed into those cockpits deserved better, every one of them. And the ones who got the Vought or the Goodyear, they got the airplane the Corsair was always supposed to be. The airplane that was still fighting in 1969. The airplane that earned its name. Subscribe for more stories like this.